The dusty trail cut through the autumn woods like a scar, narrow and uneven, strewn with fallen leaves that glowed amber and gold beneath the slanting afternoon sun. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and the faint musk of damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its voice carrying over the wind. Behind that stillness came another sound, low at first, then swelling like thunder, hoofbeats, hard and relentless, closing the distance. Eli Carter's lungs burned as he ran, every breath pulling needles into his chest. The satchel at his side slapped against his hip, the worn leather warm from his grip. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was the deed to Carter Ranch, thin paper, yet heavier than any weight he had ever carried. He dared not think what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. His boots struck the trail in rapid rhythm, scattering leaves behind him, his shadow darting through shafts of light that flickered between the trees. The voices came next, rough, laughing, cruel. The Dawson gang was in full chase now, their leader's bark rising above the rest. Jeremiah Dawson's tone was low and mean, the kind of sound that could cut a man even when no blade was drawn. Eli didn't have to look back to picture him. The black duster, the gray at his temples, and the eyes that never seemed to blink. The others were just as bad. 5 men in all, each with a reputation that carried through every saloon and back alley in 3 counties. They left no survivors. He ducked under a low-hanging branch, his shoulder grazing the bark. His father had brought him through these woods when he was small, their hunts beginning in the pale dawn and ending with venison roasting over a fire. Back then, the air here felt safe. That was before the accident, before the sheriff brought news that his father had been found with a bullet in his chest and a rifle lying clean beside him. They called it a misfire, bad luck on a hunt. The neighbors whispered murder, but no one could prove it. His mother's eyes had hardened that day, the softness gone, replaced with something quiet and steel-strong. She never remarried, never left the ranch, and never once let him forget the lessons his father had begun teaching. A branch snapped behind him. A horse snorted. Dawson's voice rolled out like a taunt. "Run, boy. Run all you want. Makes the catch sweeter." Eli pushed harder, ignoring the stitch in his side. His boots hit a patch of damp earth, sliding, but he caught himself on a root and kept going. The trail ahead forked, left toward the main road that would lead back toward town, right into the thick undergrowth, where the land began to twist and roll into ridges. He didn't hesitate. The right path led deeper into Carter hunting grounds. The townsfolk avoided that part of the forest. Too wild, too many shadows, too many stories of hunters who never came back. But Eli knew every ridge, every hollow, every place where the ground dipped under a carpet of leaves hiding snares and pits set by his father decades ago. The hunting grounds were not just land. They were a living map etched into his bones. The air cooled as he moved off the trail, the canopy overhead swallowing more of the light. His boots no longer struck open ground, but sank into the quiet give of moss. Here, the sound of the gang was muffled, their laughter replaced by mutters and the creak of leather as they drew their rifles. They thought he was a trapped animal now, a cornered thing waiting for their hands. They didn't understand that the deeper they rode, the less this was their ground. A memory flickered, his father's hand on his shoulder, guiding him through a blind made from pine boughs, the view opening to a narrow game path below. A good hunter doesn't just chase, Eli. He waits, lets the prey walk into his shadow. His father's voice had been warm that day, full of pride. Eli swallowed against the ache rising in his throat. The Dawson gang's hoofbeats grew louder again. They were pushing their horses harder now, trying to force him into a sprint he couldn't maintain. Eli didn't look back. Looking back meant losing time. He leapt over a fallen log, ducked between 2 cedars, and slid down a slope on the heels of his boots. Behind him came the thud of a horse hitting the same log, followed by a curse when one of the riders snagged his coat on a branch. The forest thickened, shadows gathering in layers. Patches of sunlight seemed to retreat, shrinking into spears of gold between the black columns of trees. Eli's breaths came ragged now, his throat raw from the cold air. Every step brought him closer to the old ridge line, a natural barrier that marked the heart of the hunting grounds. Once he crossed it, the land would be his ally. The gang was close enough now that he could hear the jingle of spurs, the grunt of saddles shifting. Dawson called out again, but this time his voice was different, less mocking, more certain. "That paper won't save your mama, boy. Best hand it over. Maybe I let you walk." Eli ignored him. Dawson's words weren't worth air. His father had faced men like this once. Men who thought land was just dirt to be taken, who thought killing was a quicker way than earning. His father had died for this ranch, and Eli wasn't going to be the one to lose it. The ridge came into sight, a wall of earth and stone rising steep among the pines. A narrow path wound up its side, steep enough to slow horses, but just manageable for someone on foot. He scrambled up, hands finding purchase in roots and rocks. A gunshot cracked, splintering bark a foot from his head. The sound rang through the trees like a warning. He ducked low, forcing himself not to freeze. Another shot echoed, this one farther off. They were trying to spook him, maybe flush him into the open. His heart hammered, but his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him over the lip of the ridge and into the deep basin beyond. Here, the trees grew older, thicker. The ground was uneven, a quilt of ridges and depressions shaped by years of wind and water. Somewhere to his left, a creek whispered over stones, hidden under a curtain of ferns. It was darker here, the sun muted into a dull glow. Eli slowed, letting his steps blend with the forest's own rhythms. He glanced back once, just enough to catch sight of them at the base of the ridge. They were dismounting now, leading their horses with caution, the slope forcing them into single file. Their shapes were darker against the dim light, like shadows that had grown teeth. Eli turned away, his breath steadying. They thought the hunt was theirs. They thought a boy could be run down like a frightened deer. But the Carter family had hunted these woods for generations, and the land had a long memory. He adjusted the satchel against his side, feeling the weight of the deed inside. The paper was more than a claim to land. It was a promise kept to a father he could barely remember without pain, and to a mother who had carried more than her share of loss. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and the faint tang of smoke, old cold, from a long-dead fire. Eli's lips tightened. He knew where he was now, and more importantly, where they were about to be. He stepped lightly, his boots finding the hidden path between two thick pines, the trail so narrow and overgrown it would vanish to anyone who didn't know it existed. Behind him, the Dawson gang followed, their footsteps heavy, their voices lower now, tinged with caution. Somewhere in their bones, they could feel it, the change in the air, the way the woods seemed to be watching. The pines rose like pillars in a cathedral, their dark trunks vanishing into crowns that swayed gently in the wind. The air beneath them was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of resin and old rain. Shafts of light speared through the canopy, each beam catching drifting motes of dust and pollen until they glowed like suspended gold. The ground was uneven, layered with years of needles and leaves, broken here and there by the deep indent of animal tracks. Elk, deer, fox, signs of life, but none of it visible now. The forest had gone still. Eli moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to this place. His breathing had steadied, his boots falling in measured, deliberate steps, each foot placed where the ground would not betray him. These woods were not meant for strangers. They were a predator's domain, and predators didn't always walk on four legs. He knew where the deer paths narrowed, where the fox dens curled under roots, where the soil dipped into soft, hidden bogs. His mother had seen to that. Even after his father was gone, she'd made sure he learned every snare knot, every blind, every way to disappear when someone dangerous was on your tail. She'd stood in the frost beside him, showing him how to read the land the way other boys read books. A bent stem, a patch of disturbed moss, a trail of scat. These were the words the forest spoke, and Eli could read them all. Somewhere behind him, laughter broke the stillness. It was harsh and loud, wrong against the hush of the trees. "Ain't no boy alive can outrun 5 men on horseback," one of them called. Another answered with a coarse joke about bringing him back to town. The sound didn't carry far. The forest was swallowing it whole. Still, Eli didn't stop. He knew the truth behind their bravado. They were trying to keep their nerves from fraying. The first sign was the horses. Their hoofbeats, once steady and close, began to slow. A frustrated curse rose above the chatter. Horses could feel it when they weren't welcome. The pines pressed in tighter here, their roots twisting across the ground in black veins, forcing the riders to weave and pick their way carefully. Some trails, the horses balked it entirely, shying from the shadows like they sensed something moving there. Eli angled toward a thicket where the undergrowth grew thick, and the light dimmed to a murky green. The gang would have to push through, and they'd make noise doing it. He, on the other hand, slipped between the trunks as if the branches shifted aside for him. A flicker of memory brushed against his mind. Himself at 10 years old, padding along behind his father on this very slope. His father had led him to a blind so well hidden Eli had walked past it twice without seeing it. Only when his father crouched and pulled back the curtain of branches did it appear, a hollow tucked into the earth, lined with pine boughs, smelling faintly of smoke and leather. "These woods remember every footstep," his father had said, settling into the blind and resting his rifle across his knees. "Treat them right, and they'll hide you. Treat them wrong, and they'll turn on you." Eli had believed him without question. He stepped over a half-buried log now, his hand brushing the same mossy surface, where he'd once traced the outline of a fox's paw. The forest here was more than memory. It was inheritance. The gang's voices were closer again. A crack of a branch, the grunt of a rider shifting in the saddle. "He's just a boy," Dawson's voice said, but it lacked the easy certainty it had held earlier. "He'll run out of places to go." Eli almost smiled. He had more places to go than they could imagine. The ridge lay ahead, its face shadowed by a wall of evergreens that blocked what little sunlight remained. It rose steep and sudden, with only one narrow pass that strangers might find. Eli didn't take it. He veered left, sliding down into a shallow gully, then slipping behind a tangle of fallen timber that formed a natural barricade. The shadows here were deep enough to swallow him whole. The gang thundered past the upper trail, their eyes scanning the obvious route ahead. None of them looked down. Eli crouched low, steadying his breath, and let the sounds fade until only the creak of saddles and the snort of uneasy horses marked their passage. He stayed still for a long moment, letting the forest reclaim its silence. Then he rose, careful not to disturb the twigs underfoot, and began to work his way parallel to the ridge line. His mind was already sketching the map, where to lead them, where to slow them, where to bleed their strength until they couldn't think straight. The hunting grounds were his family's legacy, and the Dawson gang had just stepped into the first layer of the trap. The hawk's cry cut through the stillness of the ranch yard, sharp and deliberate, not the lazy call of a bird drifting on the wind. Martha Carter froze where she stood, the split log slipping from her hand and thudding softly against the chopping block. Her eyes narrowed toward the tree line beyond the pasture. It came again, 2 short cries, then silence. "Eli." Her breath steadied, though her heart began its slow, heavy pounding. That signal wasn't used for greetings. It was a warning, a wordless flare sent through the air that meant trouble was coming fast. She had taught it to him herself when he was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, told him it might save his life one day. Now, the sound meant it was already being put to the test. Martha set down the axe, her fingers tightening and flexing once before she turned toward the porch. She moved without rush, but without hesitation, crossing the boards to where the long rifle leaned against the wall. Her hand wrapped around the worn walnut stock, and in that moment she shed the years of quiet ranch life like an old skin. Once, before Eli was born, before the Carter name had been hers, she had been Martha Clay, sharp-eyed, quick-fingered, and known in dusty towns from Kansas to Nevada as Black Hawk Martha. She could split a playing card on the edge from 30 paces, spin a pistol faster than most men could blink, and she'd made her living in a traveling Wild West show where the crowd roared every time she drew. That life ended the day she met Thomas Carter. He was different from the drifting men she'd known, solid, rooted in the earth, with a steadiness that drew her like gravity. She traded the roar of applause for the lowing of cattle and the creak of porch boards, and she'd never looked back. Until now. She checked the rifle with the care of a ritual, breech clean, chambered, sights true. A satchel of cartridges went over her shoulder, the weight settling against her hip like an old friend. She stepped off the porch and into the open pasture, the late sun throwing her shadow long across the grass. The trail to the hunting grounds was one she could walk blindfolded. It wound through a strip of meadow before sinking into low, rolling hills studded with oak and cedar. As she moved, the sounds of the ranch fell away, the clink of the windmill, the distant call of a cow, and were replaced by the layered murmur of the wild, wind and leaves, the faint rustle of something small in the underbrush, a woodpecker tapping like a far-off hammer. She kept her pace steady, eyes sweeping the ground for sign. Here, a scuffed patch where a boot heel had pressed into damp soil. There, broken fern stems, the end still wet where they'd been stepped on. Eli had passed this way, and not long ago. Martha slid into the forest like water finding a channel, her steps soundless over the soft earth. She skirted the main trail, keeping to the edges where the trees were thickest. Every so often, she paused and listened. Voices carried faintly through the timber, men's voices, coarse and careless. She could not make out the words, but the tone was enough. Strangers. Trouble. She thought of Eli out there, drawing them deeper. A boy, yes, but a boy raised by hunters. He knew the land better than they did, and if he was leading them toward the heart of the hunting grounds, it was for a reason. Her job was to make sure they didn't leave. The terrain grew rougher as she climbed a narrow ridge, the roots of the pines gripping the earth like claws. She moved along its spine, staying low, and from her vantage she caught glimpses of movement below, shapes threading through the trees, flashes of horses' flanks between shadows. There were 5 riders, their black coats like smudges against the gold-green backdrop of the forest. One rode a black stallion with a white blaze down its face, Jeremiah Dawson. Her mouth tightened. She knew that name, and the stories that came with it. Years back, when Thomas died on that so-called hunting trip, she'd heard whispers linking Dawson to the killing. But whispers were all she'd had, no proof, no witnesses, just the lingering smell of smoke on the wind and a widow's gut feeling. Now she had him in her sights. She broke off from the ridge trail, dropping down the far side and cutting through a stand of young pines whose thin needles muffled her steps. The air was cooler here, shadows draping over her shoulders. She kept parallel to the riders, moving where they could not see her, closing the distance in silence. In her mind, she worked the old patterns: angle of approach, line of sight, possible cover. Years of showmanship had taught her precision, but years on the ranch had honed her patience. She would not rush. Timing was as much a weapon as the bullet in her rifle. The ground began to slope downward, the trees giving way to a low basin. At the far end of it, partially hidden by undergrowth and a curtain of dangling moss, sat an old hunting blind. The sight of it stopped her for a moment. Thomas had built it the first year after Eli was born, tucking it into the earth, so naturally it seemed part of the land itself. She had sat in it with him on cold mornings, the two of them watching deer filter through the basin, steam curling from their breaths. Now she eased herself into it, brushing away a layer of pine needles from the bench inside. Through the narrow slits cut in the wall, she had a perfect view of the basin floor. And into that clearing, from the far side, the Dawson gang began to appear. They rode incautiously, the horses snorting and tossing their heads. The riders' eyes swept the trees, their voices lowered now. One of them muttered something that made another laugh, but the sound was brittle, hollow. The air here was different, still, watchful. Martha's finger rested lightly against the trigger guard. The gang was right where she wanted them, and they didn't even know they'd just stepped into a place built for killing. The forest swallowed sound in a way that made every noise stand out like a hammer strike. The creak of saddle leather, the huff of a restless horse, the muttered curses of men whose patience was wearing thin. The Dawson gang had come into these woods with the swagger of predators, but now that swagger was thinning, fraying at the edges. The deeper they rode, the more the air seemed to press in, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Jeremiah Dawson scanned the shadows between the pines, jaw set tight. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice low but edged with irritation. "The boy's not a ghost. He bleeds." Eli watched them from the shade of a thick spruce, body still as the trunk beside him. He had circled ahead on a deer track, so narrow no horse could follow. His mind was working in patterns, not panic. His father's old lessons coming back like echoes. This part of the hunting grounds was littered with old traps, half hidden by time, but not forgotten. He'd repaired some over the years, kept them sharp for wolves and coyotes. Tonight, they'd be for men. He moved quickly, silently, fingers working a coil of rope between two saplings. The snare's loop hung just above the leaf litter, invisible unless you knew where to look. He anchored it to a bent sapling, the tension trembling like a held breath. Then he slipped away, circling to a deadfall trap. 3 thick logs balanced on a trigger. A twist of vine, a shift of weight, and the trap was ready to drop like a hammer. Behind him, the gang advanced in a ragged line. One of the younger outlaws chuckled, trying to fill the space between trees with bravado. Boy's just running scared. I bet he's halfway to the next county. Before Dawson could answer, the forest snapped shut around them with a sound like a whip crack. A scream followed, sharp and raw. The last rider in line pitched sideways off his saddle, his leg wrenched at a terrible angle, caught fast in Eli's snare. His horse reared and bolted, crashing into the underbrush. The others wheeled around, rifles raised, scanning the trees. What the hell was that? One barked. Eli was already gone from the spot, moving like shadow to the next trap. The deadfall sat over a narrow path between 2 boulders, the perfect choke point. He crouched low, listening to the hoofbeats draw nearer, then scraped his stick across the stone, just enough noise to draw them in. One outlaw spurred his horse forward, gun up. As the animal's hooves hit the trigger, the logs dropped. The crash was deafening, the weight slamming down beside the horse's flank. Startled beyond reason, the animal bucked violently, throwing the rider into the dirt. He hit hard. The wind knocked from him, his rifle skittering out of reach. God damn it! Dawson roared, swinging in the saddle to scan the tree line. Show yourself, boy. You think this is a game. You think. His words cut off, replaced by a guttural curse. Eli stayed hidden, the heat of his breath fogging in the cool shade. Every move he made was to buy time, to thin them, to rattle them until they stopped thinking straight. He didn't need to fight all of them at once. He just needed them in pieces. The horses were restless now, ears flicking, eyes rolling white. They smelled the wrongness here. A few steps more, and the gang would be within sight of the basin. They wouldn't know it, but that was the kill zone. Narrow entry points, high ridges for cover, no clear escape. Dawson turned his horse in a tight circle, rage simmering just below his calm. You've got a choice, boy, he bellowed into the trees. Come out now. Maybe you see another sunrise. Keep hiding, and we'll drag your carcass out of here and nail it to your mama's porch. Eli clenched his jaw, but didn't move. Words were bait, and Dawson was hoping to pull him into the open. But Eli had been taught by better hunters than that. The gang pressed forward, keeping close now, rifles sweeping. They passed under a line of low branches, and for a moment, the basin opened ahead of them, quiet, wide, deceptively still. They didn't see the dark shape on the ridge, just above the curtain of moss. The shot came like lightning, sharp, clean, final. One of the outlaws jerked in the saddle and toppled sideways, his rifle falling from his hand. The echo rolled through the trees, and then there was only the ringing silence that follows sudden death. Every head snapped toward the ridgeline. That wasn't the boy. One muttered. Dawson's face shifted, the first flicker of unease breaking through. He scanned the shadows above, his voice dropping low. No, he said, almost to himself. Someone else is out here. The gang's eyes searched the ridgeline, tense fingers tightening around rifle stocks. But before any of them could react, a figure stepped from the tree line above. Martha Carter moved with the certainty of someone who belonged here, her rifle leveled, the barrel steady as stone. The brim of her hat shadowed her face, but her voice carried down to them, cold and clear. Drop your guns. The order stopped them in place. For a moment, the wind was the only thing moving, whispering through the pines. Dawson's head tilted, and a slow, humorless smile spread across his face. Well, look what we got. Blackhawk, Martha. His tone dripped with mockery, but his eyes didn't leave her rifle. Heard you put that gun away years ago. Guess hiding behind a boy was getting dull. Her grip tightened, but her voice stayed even. "You killed Thomas," she said. No preamble, no accusation to soften the blow, just the truth laid bare. "Out here in these woods. Called it an accident, so you could take our land. I've been waiting a long time for you to walk back into my sights." Dawson's smirk faltered for just a second before twisting into something harder. "Your husband was slow. Slower than me. That's all it was." "You'll find I'm not." Her rifle cracked, the bullets shaving bark from the tree beside Dawson's head. His horse reared, throwing him sideways, and the rest of the gang scattered, ducking into the trees. In the confusion, Eli moved like a shadow from his hiding place, cutting off one rider's retreat and driving him toward a narrow ravine. The man's horse balked at the sudden drop, and Eli's hand shot out, shoving the outlaw clean from the saddle. The man tumbled down the slope, weapon lost, groaning in the leaves. Martha had already shifted her aim, sighting another outlaw weaving between the pines. Her shot was precise, catching his shoulder and spinning him into the trunk behind him. The man slid down, clutching at the wound, his rifle clattering to the ground. The two worked without words, their movements in perfect rhythm. Eli flushed another rider toward the ridge, where Martha's position gave her a clean shot. She fired, the man's hat flying from his head as the bullet tore through the air inches above him, close enough to make him drop his weapon and raise his hands. "Run," she told him. He didn't hesitate, vanishing into the shadows with his empty hands high. Only Dawson kept moving toward the river, weaving through the undergrowth, his dark coat flaring with each stride. Eli darted after him, slipping between the trees, while Martha descended the slope at a measured pace, never losing sight of her target. Dawson reached the riverbank, the water running fast and cold over the rocks. His breath came in harsh bursts, one hand clutching his revolver, the other pressing to his side, where blood seeped dark against his shirt. Eli emerged from the trees opposite him, blocking his escape. For the first time since the chase began, Dawson looked between the two of them and saw the trap had closed. "You think you've got me?" he spat, the river's roar almost swallowing his words. "This land's mine by right. You and your boy just don't know when to quit." Martha stepped forward, rifle steady, eyes fixed on him. "It's been hours since before you learned to hold a gun, and today it's still ours." Dawson's gaze flicked to Eli, searching for an opening, but the boy's stance didn't waver. The river hissed at their backs, and the wind in the pines seemed to press in closer, as if the whole forest were watching. The river's current hissed over the rocks, cold mist curling into the air as Dawson's eyes darted between Martha and Eli. His revolver trembled slightly in his hand, more from exhaustion than fear, though the fear was there, buried under the bravado. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice pitched low, coaxing. "There's money, more than you've seen in your life. I've got a stash, gold too. You and the boy could take it, walk away. Forget we were ever here." Martha's stance didn't shift. "I'm not here for your money." "You think the law's going to help you?" he pressed, forcing a half-smile. "Law's just another game for those who can pay to win. I can make sure you win, Martha. I can. You don't say my name like you know me." Something in her tone stopped him. His brows furrowed, but he didn't lower the gun. "Maybe you don't remember," she said, stepping closer, her voice quiet enough that the wind almost swallowed it. "They used to call me Black Hawk, Martha. And when I was 20, there wasn't a rifleman or woman west of the Mississippi who could beat me at 100 paces. I toured the frontier with a Wild West show, shot playing cards out of the air, lit matches with bullets. I could put a hole through a coin before it hit the dirt." Dawson's jaw tightened, the flicker of recognition sparking in his eyes. "I put that part of me away when I met Thomas," she went on. "He wanted a home, a family. But the part of me that knows how to hunt, how to take a man's weapon before he can blink, that never went away. And neither did the memory of what you did to him." Dawson's gaze wavered, his voice turning brittle. "You're not going to shoot me. Not in front of the boy." Martha's rifle shifted just enough for him to notice. The shot cracked like a lightning strike. Dawson screamed, the revolver spinning from a shattered hand into the river's current. Blood dripped down his wrist, the red stark against the pale autumn light. He staggered, clutching his wrist, eyes wide with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You're done," Martha said flatly. From the trees behind them, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. A voice called out, deep and steady, "Martha Carter." Sheriff Harlan rode into view, his coat flaring behind him, a rifle balanced in his saddle. His deputies followed, rifles ready. He took in the scene with a single sweep of his eyes, Dawson bleeding at the riverbank, Martha unshaken, Eli standing watch like a seasoned scout. "Well," the sheriff said, dismounting, "looks like you saved me the trouble." He cuffed Dawson without ceremony, ignoring the outlaw's muttered curses, and jerked his head toward the trail. "Been tracking him and his boys since Abilene. Guess I'll be taking him off your hands." Dawson was hauled upright, stumbling as the deputies dragged him toward the horses. He glanced back once, but Martha had already turned away, her rifle cradled in the crook of her arm. The forest began to breathe again. The frantic rustle of pursuit faded, leaving only the wind in the high branches and the distant rush of the river. A hawk's cry cut the air, sharp and fleeting, and Eli looked up, watching it wheel above the treeline. They started home without speaking. The path wound through tall pines and maples just beginning to turn, their leaves drifting down in lazy spirals. The light slanted gold through the canopy, catching on the worn brass of Martha's rifle and the determined set of Eli's jaw. Somewhere ahead, beyond the last bend, their land waited, quiet, steadfast theirs. When they stepped into the clearing by the old Carter cabin, the hunting ground stretched out behind them like a living thing at rest. No boot prints but their own, no voices but the wind. And so the Dawson gang learned that some woods don't just belong to the land. They belong to the hunters who know every shadow in them.